Good afternoon, everyone. So for those who are teachers here, happy Teacher Appreciation Week. So my name is Melody Feng Sotani. I am an EL Family Resource Specialist at the Office of English Learners at Boston Public Schools. Today's workshop is on Boston's immigration history. It is part of our virtual Immigrant Pride Week of Action series in support of immigrants and undocumented students and families. So one of our goals is to increase educators' awareness and understanding of immigrant and undocumented students and families' experiences. So today's meeting is being recorded, so we can share that with those who cannot make it today. So first, I would like to introduce Faye Cobb, Executive Director of the Office of English Learners, to have a few words with you all. Welcome, Faye.
Thanks, Melody and team, and thanks everyone for joining us here this afternoon to celebrate our Immigrant Pride Week of Action. As we're all well aware, Boston is a proud city of immigrants, and BPS is one of the most diverse school districts in the nation. Nearly 1 in every 2 students in our district speaks a language other than English at home, and we are rich in our representation with students coming and their families from more than 130 different countries. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marilyn S. Johnson, who will be leading our presentation and time with us today. Dr. Johnson is professor of history at Boston College. Her research focuses on migration, urban social relations, and violence. In 2016, she launched the Global Boston website, and that website chronicles the history of immigration to Greater Boston since the early 19th century. And the website aims to tell the story of Boston's major immigrant groups, showing where they've come from and why, and how they've been central to Boston's history and development, as well as to that of their home countries. In her book, The New Bostonians, Dr. Johnson examines the historical confluence of recent immigration and urban transformation in Greater Boston. And with that, I will turn it now over to Dr. Marilyn Johnson for her to provide us this rich overview of our history, past and present, and then we'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Faye. Thanks, Melody, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I've spoken to BPS teachers in the past, but never to the Office of English Learners staff. So it's really great to get to meet you in a way in this strange format that we have this year. I have lived in the Boston area for more than 25 years now, and it's been in the last 15 years or so that I've been writing and researching immigration. And as Faye mentioned, I wrote this book, or released this book in 2015 about new immigrants in Boston. And I had to do some research on old immigrants in Boston to understand the structure into which new immigrants were coming, and how they were able to use some of the same institutions and housing and neighborhoods as older immigrants. And in the process, I became interested, even after I finished the book, with continuing the study. I kind of got addicted to immigration history. And so I started the Digital History Project, Global Boston. And it is an ongoing project. And I'm going to show you the website a little bit later. But we'll talk generally about immigration history before I do that. But I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback into the website. And it's an ongoing project, so I'd like to be able to provide content which my students and other colleagues help me to create that can be useful in K-12 classrooms. So I'm going to share my screen, if you just bear with me for a moment. Okay, can everyone see the screen okay? Great. All right. So when I started this project back in 2015, or actually several years before that, immigration history seemed to be becoming more and more important. And by the time the book was published, we're entering the Trump era, and now with 4 years of the Trump administration behind us, it allowed us to see the underside of American nativism and racism toward immigrants, and the toll that that's really taken on immigrant families. And over the past year, we've seen how the pandemic has revealed all sorts of systemic inequalities that have hit immigrants and people of color especially hard. And I think to understand why that is, we need to look back at history and to look both locally and nationally to see where this inequality has come from. Now, I focus on Greater Boston, not just because I live here, but because Boston has been one of the top immigrant receiving cities in the country. So it's really a wonderful place to study immigration, both old and new. It's not as big a city as New York or Los Angeles, so it's manageable. And of course, it is a very diverse immigrant population, more so than, say, the areas in the Southwest. That tend to skew more in certain groups of immigrants. On the East Coast, we tend to get quite a varied mix. Now, to understand Boston's history, as I said, I think we need to go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries to see how earlier generations of immigrants shaped the city. And there are certainly many similarities between immigration in the past and the present, but there are also important differences. Our economy is different, our immigration regime and immigration laws are different. And of course, there's been an increasing globalization of migration in the past 50 years. And all of that has implications for how newcomers are welcomed or not in Greater Boston. Okay, so it's been more than 55 years now since the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, which dramatically transformed the US immigration system. Is there anyone who's familiar, some of the teachers perhaps, with this Immigration Act and how it changed the system? Anyone want to jump in here with any? It essentially, we had an immigration system that was very restrictive prior to 1965. We had a cap, a very low cap on the number of immigrants who could enter the country. We had a quota system in effect, which limited the number of immigrants that could come from any particular country, and particularly it limited those countries outside of Western Europe. And it also gave preferences to skilled workers and family reunification. And that's, I'm sorry, no, let me drop the last part. There were no, that was the new law. So what we had then was a very restrictive system that with the 1965 Immigration Act, we saw a lot of that change. First of all, the total number of immigrants who could enter the country increased fairly significantly. And the law got rid of the old quota system and replaced it with a different quota system that was less discriminatory and less focused on Western Europe. And we start to see greater preferences for skilled workers and family reunification as a way for people to move to the top of the line, front of the line in the immigration system. So if you had family members here, if you had a type of skill or a job skill that was needed in the country, that would increase your chances of coming in. So interestingly, at the time, no one really expected the law to change the US very much. It was assumed that there would now be more people from Southern and Eastern Europe who had relatives in the country who could now come more easily. And the total number of immigrants would increase a bit because there was a labor shortage at the time, and that this would be a good thing, but it wasn't really going to change the country very much. That proved to be a very wrong assumption. Within a few decades, we saw that the law was creating a much more diverse population, both in terms of race and ethnicity, as well as class and education. Now, in Boston, we really see this. The change was quite staggering. In the 1960s, the city was heavily white, Catholic, and predominantly Irish American. Today, of course, people of color make up the majority of the city, in large part because of immigration from Asia and the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. So this chart is actually from my book. I've added some color to it in this case, but I think it shows some of the dramatic differences between 100 years, 1910 on the top pie chart, and 2010 in the second pie chart. What do you notice here? I'm gonna come out of this so I can see people. Any differences, obvious differences here that you might notice?
The majority, sorry, you can go ahead.
It's more section, more by.
Many more sections, absolutely. And I think what's striking, actually, I was surprised to find this out when I studied the old immigration, that there are only 4 groups that made up more than 3/4 of all the immigrants in 1910. They were predominantly from Canada, Ireland, Italy, and Russia, and most of those from Russia were Jewish. And many of those from Canada were actually Irish. So in some ways, it was even 3 groups that were most prominent. And if you compare that to what we see on the bottom, where we have so many, more than 24 groups that make up about 3/4 of the immigrants. And of course, where they come from is very different. The color scheme up here, the green is Europe, and you can see the green slices in this lower pie chart are pretty limited, right? And the number of percentage of Canadians is quite low as well. And it's we see instead red slices, which are countries in Asia, the brown slices, which are countries in the Caribbean, and yellow in Latin America. And then there is also a few countries which turn up here from Africa as well, Cape Verde and Nigeria. So this is a much more diverse and global group of immigrants coming from all over the world. And they're also, because of the preference for skilled immigrants, we also see many more highly educated and skilled immigrants coming in, as well as much poorer immigrants. But in the past, we had, with the Irish and the Italians and the Jews, we had typically poor and working class immigrants. We didn't have many highly skilled or educated immigrants coming in before. So the immigration laws played a big role in making our immigrant population much more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, and education and class. Okay. All right, so let me just move on to the next slide. There we go. So this chart, which is from my website, gives a longer term perspective. Here we see a very high level of immigration back in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. It peaks at around 1910, at which point Boston had a foreign-born population that made up 36% of the total. And of course, if you consider the children of immigrants, along with those who were foreign-born, that was well over 50% of the population at that time. Now, beginning in the 1920s, we start to see some changes, or even a little bit earlier, at the time of World War I. We see a prolonged drop in immigration. And there were two reasons for that. One was World War I, which disrupted the flow of migrants across the world. But then after the war was over, we see a period of immigration restriction that was put in place through various laws, and known typically as the Quota Acts, right? And these were, as I said earlier, laws that tremendously restricted immigration and also had put a quota system in place that favored those from Western Europe and disfavored those from other parts of the world. And in the case of Asia, banned immigrants from many Asian countries altogether. The result was, a significant drop in migration. And you can see the gray tab on this that runs down the middle of this chart that is showing you the old immigration quota system period. And it was marked by, decline in the city of Boston, which is the orange line, in Massachusetts, the yellow line, and also in the nation, the blue line. But immigration restriction had a longer history, and I do want to just circle back here a little bit. It wasn't just the laws of the 1920s that suddenly changed everything. We can see, precedents that were being laid earlier on. And some of these precedents started here in Massachusetts and in New York as well, but in the Northeast. And policies, for instance, were first implemented in Massachusetts and New York to ban or deport immigrants as early as the 1840s. And at the time, we're speaking mainly about Irish immigrants, those who were fleeing the Great Famine in the 1840s and 50s in Ireland. And many of them were very poor and in ill health, and were generally referred to as paupers, Irish paupers. And there were policies implemented to try and prevent the landing of Irish paupers in the city, or those who later proved unable to support themselves could be deported. So as this is, fairly recent work that has discovered this history of local immigration regulations, because back at that time period, there was no federal immigration enforcement. It was all done at the local level. And so we see Massachusetts actually leading the way in this development of deportation policies. And it was basically economic and religious resentments that helped shape these laws. And some of it would carry over into federal immigration law later on, which, as we know today, there's a vast apparatus of immigrant restriction and deportation. Another important precedent was the anti-Chinese movement, which resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And in this case, it was race that was playing the central role in defining who could become an American and who could be admitted into the country. Boston was also important in later nativist movements, such as the Immigration Restriction League that was based here in Boston, had a lot of Harvard professors who were part of their membership. And that group lobbied for the Literacy Bill of 1917. This was a bill that was passed and essentially banned the admittance of immigrants who could not read in their native language. And the attempt there was to keep out poor, illiterate immigrants from entering the country. And that became law. And then later, the Immigration Restriction League was very active in developing the legislation that became the Quota Acts of the 1920s. So all of these precedents that were laid earlier, I was surprised to find out many of them had origins in Boston and Massachusetts. Now, as a result of these laws, immigration would decline in Boston and across the country, as we saw in the chart. And there would, after World War II, there would be some exceptions granted for refugees, especially those coming from Eastern Europe, survivors of the Holocaust, and a few other special laws that were passed admitting refugees. Portugal, for instance, after some of the big volcano explosions and earthquakes in the Azores, we see some Portuguese refugees admitted, but not in any large numbers. And overall, we see the numbers of newcomers declining because of this strict immigration system. I'm going to go back just a second here, and you can see that the decline. Can't get my pointer on the. No, I'm not able to. You can't see where I'm pointing, can you? No. Okay. But anyway, if you look at the low point in 1970, nationally, the foreign-born made up only 5% of the population at that point. Here in Boston, they made up 13%. And so this would be the record low in American history once the U.S. became a country in terms of the percentage of foreign-born in the city. But after that, we do see a change. And oops, where are we? We see immigration going, oops, let me just go back a sec. We see immigration going up quite steadily from 1970 up to the present, and reaching a high of 28% or so in 2015. And again, you have to remember, this is just the foreign-born. And many of them had children, some of whom were born here. So the percentage of actual foreign-born people and their children was probably is probably closer to 40% or so. Now, during the same period of increased immigration since the 1970s, Boston has also experienced an astounding economic and physical turnaround. In the past 50 years, the city's been transformed from what I would describe as kind of a down at the heels old industrial city to a poster child of the new knowledge economy, things like tech and medicine, education, finance. So in writing my book, I wanted to know, what's the relationship between this immigration, this new immigration, and this larger urban transformation, the so-called Boston Renaissance? What I argue in the book is that the two are directly related, that immigration is very much a part of the bigger story behind the Boston Renaissance. And although immigrants are not the only factor driving Boston's revitalization, there were all kinds of other factors like, new technology and globalization and investment patterns, et cetera. I think immigration has really been overlooked as a key ingredient in this, turnaround in the city. And we can't really understand the recent history of the city or the metro area without understanding this relationship. So let me give you a few examples with a couple of charts from my book. This chart really looks at shows the relationship between the native-born population, which is in the blue, and the foreign-born, which is in the red. And in the past, these things kind of work together as Boston's economy grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Its native-born population grew, its foreign-born population grew even more so. And it kind of levels out in the 1930s and 40s because the kind of industrial development we had here tended to flatten out around that time period, mostly shoes and textiles and that kind of those kinds of industries. And then by the time we get to the 1950s, we start to see the population declining. And part of that, a lot of this had to do with the decline of these major industries, and they're leaving the city, in some cases leaving the state, or even leaving the country in the 1980s. And we see the population of the city decline with the decline of the economy. Now that continues until about into the 1970s. But in the 1980s, we start to see again a changing pattern. And we see the foreign-born population going up between 1980 and 1990 up to the present. Interestingly, though, the native-born population was not going up, not until recently. For the first 30 years or so, we saw a drop in the native-born population. But overall, the population of Boston grew because of the arrival of immigrants. So this is pretty critical in the sense that the city's population would not have grown without, and its economy would not have grown without the presence of immigrants. And our population we have an older population here, and a fairly low birth rate as well. So our population would have continued to decline, leaving us with a shortage of younger workers who are the lifeblood of the economy. So in population terms alone, I think immigration has been very significant. If we look at the labor force, we see a similar pattern. After World War II, Boston lost thousands of manufacturing jobs and workers. But since 1980, our labor force has grown almost entirely due to foreign-born workers and their children. The native-born workforce, as you can see, has remained relatively flat. And some of our most important local industries, the new industries relatively new industries of technology, medicine, biotech, education, in a range of service fields that support those industries and the people who work in them, all employ a large and growing number of immigrants. So, and these include workers who work at the higher end professional jobs, doctors, scientists, software engineers, et cetera, but also the people who clean the buildings, serve the food, do yard work, take care of children and aging parents. So I think there's no denying that the labor force of Boston would not have been able to grow, and these new industries would not have been able to flourish without the participation of immigrant workers. Immigrants have been important as entrepreneurs in this process. They have started a variety of new businesses over the years, from local bodegas and restaurants to startups in software and biotech. And many of those businesses have added jobs to the local economy. So we often hear that immigrants are a drag on the economy. They're taking jobs away from native-born residents, but it's really not a zero-sum game. First of all, immigrants take jobs that other native-born people are not often willing to do, and they start new businesses that expand the total labor market. And there's a group up in Malden, the Immigrant Learning Center, that's actually collected quite a bit of data on local businesses in tech and medicine and other fields, and have found that immigrant entrepreneurs have played a really significant role in the advance of those industries, which employ quite a lot of people now. Another way that immigrants have shaped the city is through neighborhood and community revitalization. We know that the earnings of immigrants have often been invested in things like homes and businesses, and their tax dollars have helped to revitalize urban neighborhoods and nearby suburbs. And we've seen this in community, in neighborhood after neighborhood, and in many suburban communities as well. One example I might highlight here in these two slides is Washington Street in Chinatown. The slide on top is from 1967, when this stretch of Washington Street was known as the Combat Zone, which was an adult entertainment district. There's a long story behind this. When Government Center was built through an urban renewal program in the 1960s and 70s, the city suddenly, these porn theaters and adult bookshops and whatnot started moving into other neighborhoods, and people became very concerned that these businesses were moving into their neighborhoods and protested against it. And so the mayor at the time designated this combat zone area along Washington Street as the place where these kinds of businesses could be located. Now, this was right next to, literally on the edge of Chinatown, and it was made a lot of Chinese and Chinese American families in Chinatown very upset to suddenly have this put at their doorstep and have to walk their kids through this kind of a neighborhood. There was a lot of crime and prostitution and things that really weren't conducive to good family life. And but interestingly, what happened was, once we start to get more Chinese immigrants, a new wave of Chinese immigrants coming in, and particularly those who were coming from Vietnam in the 1980s, the so-called boat people and ethnic Chinese of Vietnam who were fleeing Vietnam in the wake of the war, began moving into empty storefronts along Washington Street and starting small restaurants and businesses along here. And over time, especially as the home video and internet expanded and a lot of the adult entertainment business went online, the Vietnamese business owners started to expand, and eventually Washington Street looks like the picture you see on the bottom, and is lined with restaurants and Asian restaurants and businesses, but ones that were distinctly part of this this ethnic Chinese migration after the Vietnam War. And so now, of course, there's more and more development going on along this same strip, and you wouldn't recognize it if you had last been here in the 60s and had known how it had been at one time. It's really transformed that section of Chinatown and made it part of Chinatown in a way that it wasn't before. So this is part of a process that's happening all over the city. Initially, when immigrants came in the 1960s and 70s, the beginning of this new wave of immigrants, they tended to settle in older central districts like Chinatown and the South End. But soon, because of development pressures and gentrification, newcomers began moving outward to neighborhoods like Allston Brighton and East Boston, Dorchester, and others. These were places where older white ethnic groups had once settled, Irish, Italians, Jews, etc. But now the younger generation was moving out and the older generations were dying off. So new immigrants came and invested in homes and triple deckers the same way that the earlier groups had done. And so we start to see an outward diffusion of immigrants into these outlying neighborhoods. And they did the same in surrounding suburbs. As the city became more expensive, immigrants began to move out to some of the older, particularly industrial suburbs to just north and south of the city. They also went to more affluent Western suburbs if they were of the professional class. They might go further afield out to the mill towns, further out, places like Lawrence and Lowell, Brockton. But they went within the Boston metro area. I think these inner ring industrial suburbs are places where we've seen the biggest growth in immigrant settlement in recent years. And I would include places like Quincy, Chelsea, Malden, and Framingham. These are communities that I studied in my book. They had all been on the ropes somewhat in the 1970s and early 80s. They had lost population, they had lost jobs, just as Boston did, but they were soon repopulated and revitalized by immigrants. And you can see on the map here the difference between immigrant settlement in 1970, which was just really in Boston and a small number of suburbs just north of the city and Lynn, to what we see in 2010, which is the last good data we have until the new census comes out, that we could see immigrants spread throughout the metro area. And some places like Malden and Chelsea have foreign-born percentages of foreign-born that are close to half the population, even higher than the city of Boston itself. Now, there is a downside to all this too, which is once in motion, revitalization can lead to gentrification, which then pushes working class immigrants out, as has happened, in Boston earlier in places like the South End, and more recently in East Boston and Jamaica Plain and other places. So in a sense, immigrants became shock troops of gentrification, often not realizing that that's what was happening. But by rebuilding and revitalizing these areas, they made them more attractive to upper middle class white professionals who wanted to move into or stay in the city, and who then drove up housing prices in the process, making it less affordable for those same immigrant groups. Before I go on to problems and challenges, are there any questions or anything I can clarify? Okay. So for all the good that immigration has done for Boston, and a lot of good things have come from it, there have been a number of problems and conflicts. And I wanted to touch on just a few of them here. One is this resurgent nativism and racism that has been an ongoing problem for many immigrants of color in particular. And we've seen several episodes of nativist violence in Boston in recent decades. In my book, I write about the 1980s, when you have a large influx of Southeast Asian refugees, and the really brutal and blistering anti-Asian violence and hatred that was directed at them. And this is a story that I don't think had been told very well before, but the sources for it are out there. And I'll show you a little later one of the reports that I think is most useful for looking back on this era, which is on Global Boston. But that same anti-Asian hate, of course, we're witnessing again during the pandemic, when we're seeing rampant anti-hate crimes in Boston and other cities as well. And so this is something that is not just a result of the pandemic. It has very deep roots going back to the 19th century and anti-Chinese sentiment, and then other anti-Asian sentiment that has emerged over a long period of time. Since 9/11, we've seen growing hostility toward Muslims and those from the Middle East. And that maybe isn't being talked about quite as much now, but it's still very much with us. And if you look at any of the hate crime data on Boston and Massachusetts, we know that this is a group that continues to be targeted. Now, during the Trump administration, we saw a whole host of changes in enforcement practices and attitudes toward immigrants. And those changes have left, many immigrants confused and fearful. Many are afraid to access needed services or law enforcement when needed. And of course, the issue of domestic violence is often cited as one in which immigrants are often afraid to call the police when they are experiencing violence. And of course, that has gone up tremendously during the pandemic. So this has been a very serious issue. And I will say it affects immigrant communities across the board, not just the undocumented. There are many mixed status families that have been particularly affected and isolated as a result, because they're afraid that their undocumented family members would be exposed to deportation as a result of using any kind of public services. And of course, the pandemic has made it all worse. The undocumented can't access many kinds of housing support, and they're thus more likely to be evicted. And we've seen that happening in not only in Boston, but in Chelsea and other communities as well. Speaking of undocumented immigration, this continues to be an issue with no resolution. Immigration reform does not seem to be any more likely to be happening now than it has in the last couple of decades. Here in Boston, in Massachusetts, an estimated 15% of immigrants have come without authorization. This is less actually than in a number of other states, particularly in the South and the West, some of which have rates as high as a third undocumented. In Massachusetts, the top areas of origin for the unauthorized are Central America, Brazil, and China. And other countries as well, but those are the three biggest or regions and countries. Many of these folks are educated, more educated visa overstayers rather than those who are crossing the border illegally. But once they're here, the problems are the same. And as I say, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any likely resolution coming anytime soon. Another issue is immigrant integration, which continues to be a big challenge, particularly for poorer immigrants of color and their children. Once in the US, many of these groups' choices are often limited to certain segregated neighborhoods and schools, and that makes integration and upward mobility much more difficult. and more difficult than what many immigrants coming to America might expect, because we have this mythology of America as the land of opportunity. But depending on the color of your skin and other factors, you might not find that opportunity very easy to access. And also coming from countries where they are the majority, many immigrants of color find the US racial system somewhat baffling. Some are resistant to identifying themselves as Black, Latino, or Asian. They're more likely to describe themselves as, in terms of their nationality or their ethnicity, but not in terms of American racial categories. And some may fear being stigmatized by a society that tends to devalue non-white people. So that's a factor as well. And then that, as I'm sure all of you know who are educators, that can make for complicated relations between the first and second generation as well, because the second generation grows up here in a different racial categorization and racial system than their parents did. Finally, the fruits of the new Boston economy that immigrants have helped build have not been equally shared. Yes, there are newcomers who have well-paying jobs, nice homes in the suburbs, and are well integrated into their communities, but there are many others who continue to struggle. And that struggle is more difficult today because of this growing inequality that is typical in characteristic of the United States, but is especially evident in cities like Boston, where you have so much wealth on the one hand, and yet that wealth not being shared equitably. The lack of affordable housing, for instance, is a huge issue in Boston. Patterns of contingent labor, the so-called gig economy, which pays poorly and provides no benefits. And the growing costs of higher education. We have many institutions of higher education in the Boston area, but not many of them are very affordable to working class immigrant youth. So all of these things have made it more difficult for immigrants to help their children advance up the occupational ladder in the way that older white immigrant groups like my parents and grandparents did earlier in the 20th century. So these are problems that, in my view, absolutely have to be addressed, especially as the baby boomers continue to retire in large numbers in the next 10 to 15 years, and the US birth rate continues to fall. We will desperately need immigrants and their children to replace our lost workers, and they will need the education and the skills necessary to participate in this new knowledge economy. Now, hopefully, having experienced inequality and hardship themselves, younger immigrants will be part of the solution and help bring about political changes that can help to reduce many of these problems and challenges. And that is why I think there's so much fear of immigrants among conservatives who want to suppress immigrant voting rights and keep them out of the political process, because they realize that this is a group that is likely to be concerned about issues of inequality and access. And if they can be mobilized to vote and turn out to vote, could really tip the balance and reshape the political and economic life of the country. So I'm going to stop there for now, and then we'll take a look at Global Boston. But let me just close out of this for a moment and ask if are there any questions I can answer. I don't know if there's anything in the chat.
briefly, I don't know if I've heard you saying that. Let me put my camera. In terms of the problem and challenges that we are facing now, nativism, racism, and anti-immigrant, those are issues that we're facing at once, or we start with one way of issues that immigrants are facing, then being shifted to another form? Or are we facing all those three at once? Or are we saying that now one is being faded and we are, moving forward to a better way for the immigrants, or how should I put that? What I'm trying to say is, I didn't know much about nativism, but now it makes a lot of sense to me. And globally, when I'm looking at it, all those three problems are still there, regardless all the efforts that are being made. I don't know what you can, if you can, bring me some light in that.
Yeah, I think all of these issues are with us, and we've been seeing them more clearly recently. That's not to say they didn't exist in the past. I think that, for instance, the issue of anti-Asian violence was something that was very much talked about in the 80s, and then seemed to kind of, sometime in the 90s, it sort of receded a bit. But now all of a sudden it's everywhere, right? And we're seeing it again. And the same thing, I think that the experience of the Trump administration, with so many changes in immigration policies and the rolling back, the travel ban and the rollback of TPS and the Dreamers, and just so many things that I think we were somewhat taking for granted that these things had been at least patched together under the Obama administration, so that it wasn't a solution, but it was trying to find some way to, get by. And then suddenly to have all that taken away has been a real shock. But I think if we look at the history of immigration in this country, we know that all of those currents are there, right? And that racism has been a big part of that all along. And hopefully, as I really do think a lot of the issue of voter suppression actually is really going to be key, right? Because the demographic transition is there. It's happened. We've seen it in Boston. It's happening across the country. And I think many of these issues, we could make a lot of progress on a lot of these problems and issues, but it's really going to depend on whether people are going to have voting rights to elect people who can make those changes. And I'm not sure I would have said that, when I wrote my book, published my book 6 years ago, but it's becoming more and more clear to me.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Okay, well, maybe I'll go ahead and show you the website.
Dr. Johnson, I have a question.
Oh, yes, please.
No problem. As kind of connected with what Bodhi was asking around the growth, the evolution of xenophobic sentiments here in the United States. For the part of the presentation we hear a lot about the immigrant experience. How come certain immigrant groups forget their own immigration experience and adopt, especially here in America, where everyone has an immigrant story? How does a community lose perspective of their own story so that they now adopt a mindset that they're the original settlers of a country like the US?
Boy, that's the $1 million question. And I've talked to so many, as I've done some interviews with some of these people in older immigrant communities who are active in, telling the history of their communities. they're all kind of shocked to see how, you know, how many members of their community now are on board with, you know, various Trump policy, anti-immigrant policies. And they just, you know, I was talking to someone who is an Armenian filmmaker who's made a great film about the Armenian genocide during World War I, and said, you know, I just don't get all these people in our community who, you know, can go along with all these nativist policies, these racist policies. You know, look at that. This is, we're people who survived genocide, you know, and ethnic cleansing, and how can this, you know, how can people forget so quickly? And I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but I think part of it is in this uniquely American exceptionalism, right? That we are this, you know, unlike any other country in the world, and it's the place where you can, you know, a poor person can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed and become, you know, fabulously wealthy and successful. And that if you're, but it's all dependent on you being a, you know, a hardworking individual who can, you know, pull yourself up and rise above, you know, all obstacles. And there's something about that sense of individualism that I think people default to once they've been here and they've succeeded, and particularly subsequent generations. I don't know if immigrants themselves do it so often right away, but often the next generation, if they have succeeded and they've integrated, and then they're more likely to say, you know, here I am on third base, and you know, I must have hit a triple, right? And it's all becomes a story of individual success rather than, which is part of the American dream, right? But not one of the need for, they forget about all of the collective efforts and the having a system during the New Deal years where, you know, we had unions had greater power and could win better working conditions and wages and benefits for workers. You had, you know, the GI Bill and providing, you know, home loans and education loans, mainly for white immigrants and ethnics. But for, you know, it was reaching a large segment of that immigrant working class. And really, I know in my father's case, you know, he would not have been a successful middle-class businessman if he hadn't been able to go to school on the GI Bill and get a home loan to buy a house in Levittown, right? And we forget about all that, right? Since that's been, much of that's been rolled back. We forget about the sort of collective and government-assisted programs to help us as a collectivity, and we just remember the individual success and accomplishment. So I think that may be part of it.
Before you transition to the website, we also have one question posted in the chat. And the question is, could you speak about your research as it relates to Boston busing desegregation?
Well, very briefly, I didn't write about this too much, but I think there's a lot of work to be done on this. And I hope that Donna Bivens' project, which went out and talked to so many different people and communities about their experience with busing, people who were the parents and grandparents of Boston public school students now, who experienced busing back in the 70s. And hopefully we'll be able to see more writing about that and understand that experience better. But I will say that I think there was a lot of confusion about it, and it didn't, for instance, you had some families, Latino families, where one child would be considered Black and sent to one school, and another child would be considered white and sent to another school, right? Which is completely something that wasn't supposed to happen, right? And then it also worked at cross currents to certain efforts of bilingual education that were going on in Asian and Latino communities. And that created a lot of problems in terms of being able to keep those bilingual schools, which parents had, worked very hard to make happen, to potentially, break up large groups of students from one racial ethnic background. And so you had competing sort of efforts within the school system. So I think I think we just don't know enough about this. There are some tantalizing stories out there about the ways that this affected immigrant communities, but I think we're going to have to wait for more research on this in the future. There is a scholar who, her name is Tatiana Cruz, who is at Lesley College in Cambridge and Lesley University, and she actually has done her dissertation looking at the experience of Latinos during the and their relationship to the Black community, and particularly during the busing era. And when her work is published, I think we'll know a little bit more about that. So I think we will be seeing more in the future. Thanks for that question. You're all asking hard questions, really good ones. All right, let me share my screen again. Or am I sharing? I can't, I'm not sharing. There we go. Okay. So this is the website, Global Boston, and it has 4 main areas. One is Eras of Migration, which is a chronological overview of immigration, the history of immigration in Boston. Then we have a section on groups, different ethnic groups that make up the immigrant communities. Immigrant places, which takes a geographical approach, looking at neighborhoods and different neighborhoods and communities. And then nativism and racism, which I think is self-explanatory. But let me just show you a few things about how this works. Here's the chart you've already seen, but it shows the immigration over time. And then it's broken into 4 different sections, which you can read. And at the bottom here is an interactive timeline, which you can see, and there are some videos and images and other things embedded in it. And then you can click on some of these different pages, which look at different time periods. And then at the bottom of each page, there are different features, which often provide first-hand accounts. Not all, some of them are more narrative in nature, but some of them have first-hand accounts. There are, for instance, video interviews and audio interviews with different immigrants or immigrant activists. This is a story on the history of sanctuary cities, which in the Boston area, which started in Cambridge in the 1980s when many Central Americans were moving there, and also has some interviews with activists who were involved with creating the sanctuary cities. And we also include some of the excellent publications that have been done by the Boston, what used to be called the Boston Redevelopment Agency is now the Boston Planning and Redevelopment Agency, or maybe I'm getting the name wrong. But each page has different features on it. And then if we look at ethnic groups, we have it's features on different groups that are most prevalent in Boston. And we have about 8 groups that are considered the older immigrant groups that came in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. And then we have a similar number of new groups that have come since the 1960s or so. And there are other groups to come, but these are the ones that we've done so far. We concentrated on some of the larger groups. And we also have a separate category on refugees and asylees because they come from many, many countries, but their conditions are different because they're refugees, so they have a somewhat different experience. And here, we've tabulated some data on the numbers of refugees arriving in Massachusetts over the last 25 years or so, the top countries that they come from. And again, we have quite a few video interviews with refugees. And I want to give a shout out here to students of Boston College who conducted these interviews. I work with a Professor Elizabeth Graver, who teaches an immigrant literatures class. And it's also the core class, core literature class at Boston College. So it's a required for all students to take a writing class. And this one in particular is for English language learners. And so the students themselves are immigrants, and they often are able to get terrific interviews with their family members or neighbors or friends. And then the assignment in the class is to produce a 10-minute video. And the best ones get shared with me, and we've been able to post them, a number of them on Global Boston. And quite a bit of the content on the website has been done working with graduate students and undergraduates in courses and in summer work programs and others. So for me, it's been a real joy to work with students in developing this content and this knowledge. And then Immigrant Places, first of all, has an interactive map that shows the prevalence of immigrants in different communities over time. And then we have different neighborhoods in Boston. We have a few communities outside of Boston, like Cambridge and Chelsea. We recently did a feature on. And Maynard, which was a student of mine who was from Maynard, and it was a very large mill there and a very fascinating history, which she wrote up recently. I'll just show you what one of these sites looks like. We'll go to Roxbury. And this is Dudley Square in a different era. And it gives a basic overview of immigrant life in Roxbury over time, going right up to the present. And two features here. One of them, which is about Dudley Square when it was a center of Irish and Canadian music in back in the mid 20th century. And it's got some music there that was recorded in some of those dance halls back in the 1940s, which I got from Boston College. And over here is excerpts from a video interview that I did with the legendary Frida Garcia, who was a Dominican immigrant who founded the first multi-service center for Latinos in the city back in the late 1960s. And all of the interviews that we've done are archived at Northeastern University and are available you can get the full interview if you're interested. We're in the process of getting them processed and put up at Northeastern, but it's nice to have short excerpts on the webpage themselves. And then this is an important one here. This is a for teachers page, which was developed by a graduate student at the Lynch School of Education who I worked with, did an independent study with, and she's now a teacher at Somerville High School. And she developed these 7 lesson plans for using material on Global Boston that can be used with middle school and high school students, and maybe even adapted for some of it for elementary students. So I hope you'll take a look at this, and if you like it, use it and share it. And then we have a bibliography, which I believe, I know to be the most comprehensive bibliography on Boston immigration history, has many different categories, goes by groups, for instance, and there are many different groups listed. These are basically academic and popular historical works on immigrants in Boston, which we update regularly. We also have other subjects like work in the economy, nativism and racism, religion, and politics. And then finally, we have a list of ethnic newspapers in Greater Boston, and these are both historical and present day. And we provide links to those that are available online and say where the others that many of them are at the Boston Public Library, but I think this is the only comprehensive list of the foreign language press in Greater Boston. So that sort of summarizes what we have. And oops, what else do we have here? And I'll just conclude with that page. That's my book from 2015, The New Bostonians, and website address. And I would love to, if you're able to take a look at the website, and if you have any input or feedback, do email me. I would love to hear what it is you would like to see on the website, because as I say, it's a work in progress. We continue to develop new content. And if there are certain features we can develop that would be useful for educators, for students, we'd love to hear about it. And beyond that, I'm happy to take your questions. And
thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for your presentation. So next, my colleague Nekla will support with facilitating the Q&A.
great.
As we now prepare to hear from all of you, I want to go over the housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please use the raise hand function that it's located down on the reaction button. If you can see it, once you click the options, and we ask the participant if you can ask only one question for 1 minute to allow to get as many questions. So we will proceed with the questions. I think most of the questions were asked during the presentation. Or maybe you can type also your question, the chat.
Nagla, we do have a question in the chat asking about the name of the researcher who's coming out with information or research on Latino families during segregation, I think during the busing.
That's Tatiana Cruz. And I think somebody put a link to her. Yes.
Yeah, Melody put a link for that.
She has an article out, which I can send you I don't have the citation right now, but I know she'll be publishing a book that will have even more. I'm curious, is immigration a subject that you all teach in your classes? Is there, I'm wondering if there's a way to be using Global Boston, or what we could be offering you all that would be helpful in your teaching? Those of you who are teachers.
I think immigration is a living subject, so it's not a subject. Like, I'm curious to go over the research and see, go over the website.
Hi, Dr. Johnson. My name is
Hi.
Isabel Sanat. I am a current guidance counselor at Boston International High School and Newcomers Academy. I don't have a real question, but I just wanted to say that your presentation was very insightful. As a counselor of newly arriving immigrant students, I know that there are a lot of struggles, but one of the questions, and maybe you may not be able to answer it, but one of the things that I see personally changing in my school is the demographic of students coming in. And so we used to have a bigger population of like Dominicans, Haitians, Cape Verdeans, and now we're seeing an influx of Central Americans. And I could say that that was pretty consistent in the past 3 years. But this year, I saw that things were slowing down, obviously because of COVID, but I also see the decline in families wanting to settle in Boston. And I wonder if you've kind of seen that trend and kind of figure out where folks are going, because we're feeling it a lot in our school.
Yeah, no, I think that's been going on for a while now, and it probably has to do with the unaffordability of Boston and how difficult it is, particularly for families. One of the things I looked at in when I was studying Chelsea was exactly, why is it that there were so many Central Americans moving to Chelsea and out of Boston, out of Cambridge, out of Somerville, and going to Chelsea? And a lot of it was they were families, and families that needed to have, apartments, and as opposed to, single young men or women who might be able to share an apartment somewhere and get by. And in Boston, that's becoming harder and harder to do in a lot of neighborhoods. And I think we've seen the same pattern with Haitians and Cape Verdeans moving to Brockton and other areas, suburbs to the south. And many of the immigrant service organizations that started in Boston have satellite offices now in certain suburbs where people are migrating to. And I think it's very much about housing affordability, and it may be other factors too. I mean, once Brockton becomes established as, a place for Cape Verdeans and Haitians to live, and the community becomes bigger and more supportive, then people start going there directly, right? And we've seen that going back in time with places like Lawrence, which, initially was people, Dominicans who were wanting to get out of Boston and families wanting to get a house somewhere that was affordable. And then as that community grew, people started coming directly from New York, directly from the Dominican Republic, and going to Lawrence. So I think we've seen that, for a lot of different groups.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Yeah, my hope is that the new mayors will work closely with BPS, because I know that we as a district are doing a lot of work with immigrant students. And I hope that the other folks that are stakeholders will see that and kind of maybe build some things in here to support our students to keep them here, because we do have a lot of resources.
I know, that's very true. And it's unfortunate that just at the time that the resources are becoming more available, the city itself is becoming less affordable, and therefore it's harder to access those resources. Thank you. That's a great question and comment.
Thank you.
Someone wrote in the chat, the weather is a factor of moving out of Massachusetts. Yeah, we can all appreciate that. And it's true, there were certain groups, like Cubans, for instance. We had pretty big, sizable Cuban communities in Boston in the 1960s and 70s. And those communities have shrunken, and people have moved to South Florida, right? Other warmer climes. So that is a factor for some groups.
It looks like we don't have more questions. So yeah, so first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for your informative and insightful presentation. We are just so honored to have you. And thank you all the teachers and school counselor and the community members who are joining us today. Tomorrow we will have another workshop like on how educators can support our undocumented students and families. And on Friday, we have a panel discussion on immigration experience. So I am sending the link to the chat. So we really hope to see you there. And also like the recording of today's workshop will be posted on the BPS YouTube channel. So if you have any colleagues who couldn't make it today, please feel free to share that with them. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you for having me. This is great. Really appreciate the chance to talk to you all. And
thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.